preceded what are many of the other epochal episodes of the civil rights movement in this country. The freedom rides, the March on Washington, the lunch counter sit-ins, and so on. And there's nothing wrong historically about citing those episodes, but it's an incomplete sense of the origins of the movement. And similarly, when people today think about Hubert Humphrey, if they know of him at all, they tend to think of the latter 10 or 12 years of his life and his political life when he was a disparaged and ridiculed and even reviled public figure associated with Lyndon Johnson as Johnson's vice president when both of them catastrophically pursued escalation in Vietnam. A man who received his long-sought nomination from the Democratic Party for president in 1968, but got it amid the police riot in Chicago against unarmed anti-war protesters and journalists, and lost to Richard Nixon very narrowly, and then, maybe even most damagingly, ran in 1972 as the worn-out establishment, middle-of-the-road candidate for the Democratic nomination, again, against his former protege, George McGovern, the peace candidate who thrilled young voters. And I still remember being in college and reading my copy of Rolling Stone as a good college student would at that time, in which Hunter Thompson made his infamous observation that the desperate, frenetic Humphrey of the 72 campaign was campaigning, quote, like a rat in heat. And so it seemed almost grimly appropriate that Hubert Humphrey died very young, very ahead of his time. You can see him celebrating the last Christmas of his life in 1977, just a few weeks before he was going to die of cancer at the age of 66, because it seemed like his political salience had expired even before his bodily presence did. And again, there's nothing historically inaccurate about what I've said about Humphrey's latter career, and it's even defensible many of the criticisms that were levied against him, if not the exact rhetoric that Hunter Thompson used. But once again, it's incomplete. And so when we think about the origins of the civil rights movement, we have to roll the time frame back a decade before the 1950s and think about the incredible efforts that occurred in the movement in the 1940s. That was a time when the movement was led by people like A. Philip Randolph of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, Walter White of the NAACP, Mary McLeod Bethune, founder, of course, of Bethune-Cookman College right here in Florida. And it was a decade when the moral force of the movement came from black GIs, came from young black men who, in going to war against global fascism, against a country that treated them as best as second-class citizens, and often barely as human beings at all, came up with a slogan and a program they called Double V. One V standing for victory over fascism abroad, the other V standing for post-war victory over Jim Crow at home. And similarly, there's a decade of Hubert Humphrey's life before he gets into the Senate, before most of the country knows him, when he's the mayor of Minneapolis, moving into public life in that city, and making Minneapolis a national symbol of progress on civil rights and human rights. And even people who know of Humphrey, even people who admire Humphrey, tend to know very little, if anything, about this part of his life. And yet the later Humphrey, not only the Humphrey of Vietnam, but the Humphrey who with Lyndon Johnson helped push through the civil rights laws of the mid-1960s, would not have happened without this Humphrey. But it's completely unlikely that Humphrey would have been that person to connect with the civil rights movement of the 1940s. There's probably hardly anyone on earth who would have been less predictable as a champion of the rights not only of American blacks, but also of American Jews than Hubert Humphrey. Because Hubert Humphrey grew up there, Dolan, South Dakota, population something like 600, set up by the Chicago Northwestern Railroad Company out in the wheat fields of eastern South Dakota, purely so that the farmers could ship in their wheat to the flour mills of Minneapolis, their livestock to the slaughterhouses